The piece you're about to hear, Sanjo for Violin and Piano, was composed by a renowned Korean composer, Un-Yung, also my maternal grandfather. He composed this piece in 1955, just a couple of years after the Korean War. It has 3 movements, and they're played without breaks. Listen for the things that sound unusual or surprising to you. What types of rhythmic feel does it have? How would you describe the melodies? What emotions does the piece communicate? Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, that's hard to do. So I have been a violinist for 43 years. Until 3 years ago, I was a regular violinist. Like most classically trained violinists, I grew up listening to and studying a lot of solo and chamber music, concertos and symphonies composed by mostly European and some North and South American composers. In all honesty, learning these standard repertoire takes so many decades of diligent practicing, lessons, and performing that it's really easy to forget that there are other art musics in the world. As a violinist, I teach others the technique necessary to produce many types of what would be considered resonant and articulate sounds with as little physical laboring as possible. I also teach others how to listen critically and analyze what they hear. With the aim of developing interpretive skills, my students and I spend a lot of time in lesson figuring out, by both listening in depth and examining the sheet music in detail, recognizable patterns in rhythm, melody, harmony, structure, etc., in the repertoire that they're working on. Although often a slow process, studying the violin is a thorough and logical process with a clear goal of learning to communicate effectively with the audience. I have always loved my job as a musician and a music teacher. Then, about 5 years ago, I ran into my grandfather's composition, which you just heard. I thought I was old enough and experienced enough as a musician to give his Sanjo a good performance. It turned out, although played on two of the most familiar musical instruments, violin and piano, which also happens to be my favorite combination of instruments, there was nothing familiar about this piece. It did not make sense to me. Why are the prescribed tempos so slow? How do I play such a long note in one bow? How can I use vibrato on the long notes that are so uncomfortable to play? What are these rhythms supposed to sound like? The more I tried to play the piece well, the clearer it became that I was randomly guessing the musical style. I had so many questions, but no answers. Even though I was born in Korea, I knew nothing about this musical style. And what's more, this was music composed by my own grandfather. My grandfather, Un-Yung, was a pioneer of modern Korean composition. Born in Korea in 1922 during the Japanese colonization period, he grew up hearing traditional music at home and later received his formal training in Western composition in Japan. Throughout his life, he firmly believed that Korean compositions must be first grounded in the native musical elements, then modernized. His Sanjo, completed in April of 1955, is an outstanding example of this maxim, as he used Western instruments to portray essential characteristics of traditional music. Since my grandfather called his piece Sanjo, knowing what Sanjo was could help, I thought. The internet said that in traditional music, Sanjo was a genre of solo instrumental music with drum accompaniment. That didn't help at all. The flowery explanations found on Korean websites didn't make sense either. They seemed to be for people who already knew some things about traditional music. Then, when I went to Korea to research about Korean music, I found out that I was not the only violinist who did not know what Sanjo was. In fact, traditional Korean music had been disregarded, belittled, and even detested for over a century by most Korean musicians who were trained in Western music. Compared to the noble, articulate, clean, and smooth sounds of the Western classical music that had poured into Korea in the first half of the 20th century, along with the schools and hospitals built by foreign missions, the husky, guttural, shaking, and crying sounds of the traditional music seemed to represent all the things that Koreans never wanted to think back on: poverty, hunger, oppression, pain, sickness, and so much death. Until 3 years ago, I did not know enough about Korean culture and history to appreciate the depth of the feelings and the stories that the traditional music told about Korea and the Korean people. My desire to play my grandfather's Sanjo better eventually led me to the new study of playing the traditional Sanjo on the violin. As I listened to more and more traditional music every day, I found myself deeply drawn to it. My Korean music teachers informed me that no Western-trained musicians had done this work before, but I was so excited at the possibility of experiencing firsthand the native music that must have meant a lot to my grandfather that I didn't stop to imagine how difficult the learning process might be or how it might turn my life upside down. Since I was the first person to do this work, the only way to learn was by watching Korean musicians perform sanjo on the traditional instrument and imitating it on my violin. I carefully watched and listened to the same recordings every day. To my dismay, I could not even tell what notes they were playing. The nasal timbre of the instruments made it very hard. For a while, I did not want to believe that I couldn't tell the notes, so I recorded snippets of their performances on my phone and listened to it, same clip, 40, 50 times in a row at a 50% speed. That confused me even more. I could not get a handle on the rhythms either. At times, I couldn't even tell if the sound was getting louder or softer. By the way, many of us have had experienced a similar type of challenges when learning to speak a foreign language. I did when I first came to the US. Unfortunately, Korean and English languages have nothing in common. And that meant, until my ears could discern the subtler nuances of spoken English, my pronunciation of words and inflection of sentences sounded so awkward, they were even incomprehensible to my American teachers, friends, and neighbors. I did have the sheet music to the traditional sanjo I was studying, but it was written with errors, or so I thought. Plus, the ever-bending and curving tones, a prominent characteristic of Korean music and instruments, were impossible to pin down and write out on the staff paper anyway. Not surprisingly, traditional Korean musicians do not use sheet music to learn sanjo. Sanjo is learned by ear over a course of many years, as the pupils meticulously imitate and memorize their teacher's playing. These musicians typically spend their lifetime mastering just one sanjo. They practice it every day with a strong sense of responsibility to preserve and pass it on to their pupils. But for me, a Western classical music professional, learning music by ear alone was unthinkable. I made corrections to the sheet music every day, trying to write down what I heard as accurately as possible. However, what I wrote down seemed completely wrong just the next day. And my teachers would chime in to confirm that my playing sounded unnatural and strange indeed. How devastating for a violin teacher. I kept a notebook in which I wrote down my endless questions while trying to figure out how to play sanjo. When I go back and read them, it's obvious that I was desperately looking for recognizable patterns in what I observed so that I could make rules and systems out of them. My notes also show how impatient I was to draw clear-cut conclusions, even when I did not have sufficient information or evidence. I had a really hard time with these relentless, unsettling feelings. This was not how I liked to feel about a music learning process. About a year into my research, I wrote in my notebook, since traditional Korean music does not employ harmony or counterpoint as Western music does, there is no need, and more importantly, no way to figure out the exact placement of individual pitches. That was a revolutionary discovery for me, a Western musician. It seems that all the oral and analytical unsettling was more than enough for me to deal with, but there was still more to come. Toward the end of the second year of my research, a piano lid fell and smashed my left hand's ring finger. After the initial shock and many what-ifs scenarios imagined by my family, especially my mom, my friends, and myself, I began experimenting with playing the sanjo using just 3 fingers. To my great surprise, having 1 fewer finger actually helped my brain to let go of the technical rules that my left hand had drilled in for 40 years to play in the Western classical style. I was also able to get past my preoccupation with the exact placement of each note, and instead began appreciating the shapes that the sequence of bending and curving tones created. Shapes and contours are at the heart of Korean melodies, and breaking my finger gave me that extra push I needed to wholeheartedly embrace what I was beginning to understand in my mind. During the next 5 to 6 months, while I couldn't play normally, my sanjo playing began to sound much more natural, according to my teachers. Learning Sanjo has also challenged how I view performing arts as a whole. I have been told by many Korean musicians that true Sanjo playing must be honest. When you are young, your Sanjo playing sounds energetic. When you are sick, your Sanjo should sound frail. When you're feeling sad, your Sanjo should drag and scratch more. When you're old, your Sanjo is unhurried and full of subtler nuances. If I were to describe a sonata or symphony as music that memorializes or celebrates an important event in the life of a person, community, or nation, I would say that Sanjo depicts an ordinary day in an ordinary person's life. Imagine farming families in an impoverished nation getting up early every day to work in the rice field, wondering if there would be too much or too little rain, too much or too little sun, until harvest, and then soon finding themselves back in the bitter winter of scarcity. This cycle would repeat throughout their lives, keeping them awake with much longing, hunger, worrying, sorrow, and sometimes relief. The depth of emotions experienced in an ordinary person's everyday life is expressed in Sanjo's melodic phrases that draw from the inflections of spoken Korean. Sanjo performers are taught to bare their souls in their music. Not doing this would make Sanjo utterly worthless. On the contrary, Western classical musicians are taught to transcend their circumstances to produce the most beautiful rendition possible, no matter what is going on in their lives. In a couple of the Sanjo lessons I had with one of my teachers on Zoom last year, I was scolded for the state of my mind. He said that although I was technically playing the Sanjo well enough, my mind was too busy and scattered, unfit to receive instruction. I was excused from 2 lessons. Traditional Sanjo is made up of several movements of increasing speed and is built on the unique Korean rhythm patterns. In a traditional Sanjo, the rhythmic patterns are improvised in the accompaniment part played by the Korean drum called janggu. In my grandfather's Sanjo, the janggu part is carried out in the piano part, although not improvised. Korean musical expressions are contrasting to those of the Western classical music in every way. One example is tempo. In Western music, while it's not uncommon to have a slow introduction, the body of the movement is usually in a faster tempo with energetic characters. On the contrary, although Sanjo can get to a very fast tempo, those playful and virtuosic moments are relatively brief in comparison to the amount of time spent in a slow tempo with anguished expressions. All traditional Sanjo begins and ends in a slow tempo. Like this tempo example, the more I learn, the more examples I see where Sanjo and Western classical music pursue opposite aesthetic values. The good news for me is that now I am not bothered or surprised that I can't tell what's going on, even after listening to the same melody 20, 30, or 40 times. In the past 3 years of my research, I have met several individuals in musicology, ethnomusicology, and performing arts, both in the US and in Korea. They have repeatedly gone out of their way to help me. As I continue to work with my mentors, I recognize that while the Western research methods emphasize the thoroughness and the soundness of the investigative processes, the Korean ways of training focus much more on the outcomes and show little interest in the processes. Having grown up in the States from 10th grade, it's easy for me to assume that the ways that I have been taught in the US are better, more logical, more sophisticated, and more efficient. One of my mentors, Robert C. Provine, is an American musicologist who has spent his entire career on advocating for traditional Korean music. Last week, I received a package from my mom that contained several very old books from my grandfather's library in Seoul. Among them was Robert's dissertation, privately published in 1975 when he was 30 years old living in Korea. Robert says that there's a very good chance that he handed this tan-covered book to my grandfather himself, since the book was not sold in bookstores. I'm overwhelmed. Something else I have been learning over and over is that studies like mine are bound to run into deep heartaches and disappointments that result from clashes of cultural and interpersonal expectations. In the first 2 years of my research, I often aggravated my Korean teachers with my endless how-to questions. I was taught in the US to ask questions. I now know better. My questions to my Korean teachers can wait. I first need to take the time to listen and wrestle more. On several occasions, I have been deeply distraught to find out that I had inadvertently offended my teachers and their colleagues by my words and actions that they considered Western and cold-hearted. While knowing that, in the cultural context, any effort to explain myself to them could be viewed disrespectful and could lead to losing my relationship with them, I felt embarrassed, angry, and even tempted to become bitter toward them. These entangling situations, combined with the unrelenting challenges of learning Sanjo, were simply exhausting. I was often stressed from dealing with situations that were totally out of my control. Many times I wanted to scream and quit. That's enough, you people. Don't you see that I love the music that you love? I'm trying my hardest to learn, and you are all being too ridiculous. But these have also been the key moments that I was confronted with the most unsettling question of all. Why am I doing this? What is my true motivation? My Sanjo study draws me to ponder who God made me to be. I must be on this journey because God has called me to it. After all the opportunities have come to find me. I did not know enough to pursue them. One thing I do know for sure is that I don't know much. I'm not trying to sound humble. My name in Chinese characters mean white and black, and that seems like a much less complicated way of navigating through life. However, because I know that I don't know much, I also know that the only way through this journey is to look to God, who does know everything and has orchestrated everything. The deeper awareness that I really don't know much is slowly freeing me from my biases, resulted from decades of fear and pride. Learning Sanjo has also grown my appreciation and compassion for others. They may be trying and working very hard, but they are not yet seeing the fruit of their work. I know so well how they feel. In my 33rd year of living in the US, my journey with Korean music is teaching me about my root, the Korean part of my identity. Although I got along just fine without thinking about that for 3 decades, now I am met by the question constantly, do I embrace my Koreanness with all of its inconveniences and messiness, or do I stay at a distance? By God's grace, I embrace. After 3 years of wrestling with Sanjo, I am still in awe of this powerful and beautiful music. I have performed both the traditional Sanjo and my grandfather's Sanjo several times, and every time I am so glad that Korean music has found me, both personally and professionally. I want to make this unique musical language known to the world with the familiar sound of the violin. It's my privilege to share this music that God gave to Koreans. Here are the words from the conclusion paragraph of my mentor Robert's dissertation from 1975 regarding traditional Korean music. Lamentably, those who above all should realize this genuine musical art form, the Koreans, have largely come to consider it of primitive peasant level and offer a deaf ear. Foreign musicians simply have not had the opportunity to enjoy it. Those few of us fortunate enough to study it closely have invariably become staunch advocates. If this pamphlet makes some small contribution to the understanding and appreciation, the reward is sufficient. Thank you very much for listening.